Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today. We're going to have a great conversation with Mark DeVine, talking about a variety of things, everything from the Young Restless and Reformed to zero in on Darrin Patrick, who is a friend of mine and Mark worked with for a while. So I really hope you glean some wisdom from today's episode. Before we get into that, I wanted to remind you of jchasedavis.com, where you can find all my writing. I publish my sermons there. I do kind of a weekly or monthly update on various outlets I've written on and talks I've given. So head over to J. Chase Davis and subscribe to the newsletter over there. You can also go to the link in the show notes for the Patreon and get early access to every episode of the podcast, as well as interact with me, suggest things to me there. A couple of great sponsors of the program, Farmer Bill Provisions. They make great biltong. You may be asking, what is biltong? It's like a beef jerky, but made all naturally, so it doesn't have all the preservatives and sugar that you would find at your local 7-Eleven or wherever you buy beef jerky. You can head over to farmerbillsprovisions.com, use code FULLPROOF, F-U-L-L, proof, one word, and get 20% off your order. Also, to remind you about Legacy Profits Club. If you are looking to get into stock trading and don't want to lose all your money and treat it like gambling, you need to get involved with Legacy Profits Club. Derek over there will help you and guide you, provides tons of training and tips on how to get involved in the stock market, become anti-fragile, so that you can start building wealth. And lastly, IonLayer.com. IonLayer produces NAD plus patches. They're always coming out with new products. These are things that I use to help with injury recovery, as I got injured last year, but also just maintaining muscle stamina and growth, as well as mental acuity. Your NAD plus levels naturally decline as you age, and so you need to get those NAD plus levels up if you were looking to reconquista America. So head over to IonLayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit, money back guarantee if you're not happy with it, and it's super affordable compared to what you're going to get out there with IV drips for NAD plus supplements. So head over to IonLayer.com, use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. Lots of great products over there. Stay in touch with them, and let's get into today's episode. Host, it's good to be with you here today. We're going to have a great conversation with a great guest named Mark DeVine, Dr. Mark DeVine, down at Samford University. And for those who don't know you, Mark, I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of introduce yourself to them, a little bit of your background. You have a lot of experience writing books, teaching in evangelical Christianity, Southern Baptist life. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in 1960 in Atlanta, Georgia, into a blue-collar family that's really from Spartanburg, and my father was laid off, and so he went to Atlanta to get his old job, and I was born there and inhaled there, but then exhaled in Spartanburg. So I grew up there. My mother carried me into a Southern Baptist church in her womb. I've never been part of any other denomination. I got on drugs. When I was 13, I started smoking marijuana. Within 4 years, I was an intravenous drug user. I had a Damascus Road turnaround when I was 16 after my mother. She took her own life. She had schizophrenia. Thought I would go into the minute. I went back to the church where I was raised, and I'm an extrovert. I like to be up in front of people talking. I thought that's what I'll do. But I was always good in math and science. And once I got to know my pastor and saw that my church was hard on pastors, I decided no way will I do that. And so I earned a degree in electrical engineering at Clemson as an attempt not to go into the ministry that failed. Went to Southern Seminary and earned 2 degrees there with 3 years in between. I went and pastored churches in Charleston, South Carolina. I did a little stint at the University of Chicago. I pastored a church while I was in seminary out in Kentucky. I responded to a job request from the International Mission Board, and we were there kind of between stints at Midwestern Seminary. I taught at Midwestern Seminary for 12 years, but with 3 years jammed in there where we were missionaries in Thailand and in Bangkok, and we expected really just to die there. And there are reasons why that didn't happen. So after I became a teacher, I realized I couldn't stand it when I was not preaching every week. And then so I started doing these interims, and so I started doing interim pastorates, and then sometimes those would morph into bivocational pastorates or longer term things. I've done like 23 of these. I've been a full-time pastor, but then I've had this long stretch of doing interims, and then I was able to help a troubled church, and then I stupidly got the reputation as a fixer.
Hmm.
Hilarious. But what that's resulted in is being called to, a lot of troubled churches and kind of gaining some skills there. And sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. I became reformed as a teenager while I was at Clemson. I started reading books according to the footnotes in a kind of a liberal Baptist theology book. And I read Karl Barth. I ended up writing on Barth for my dissertation, but I found Luther and Calvin through Barth. And so I was reformed before I knew I would eventually find Timothy George. Timothy George, who was a professor at Southern. Years ago, these professors would go to colleges, like go to the Baptist Student Union, which I think now is called something else, Baptist Christian Ministries or something, but to recruit, And I met him, and I was so thrilled that he thought it was okay that I was reading Barth. He thought it was okay. And I had just started reading Calvin, and he thought that was okay. And that was great because when I was reading Tillich and Bultmann and these people, then the pastors I knew were happy. And then when I started reading Barth, they just kind of cocked their head like a dog that's confused.
Sure.
And then when they found out I was reading Calvin, now they're having, they're praying for me. The Lord would help him. And so I became reformed. And then I started meeting these other people like Tom Askell and his brother Bill and founders, and discovering that I met Ernie Reisinger, but he republished these books by James Pettigrew Boyce and John L. Dagg, and found my way into the Reformed Baptist world. And then I was born into a solidly Democrat, sort of liberal Democrat family. And so, I left that. And it was very hard. It was very hard. It was such a big part of my identity and my whole family's identity, really, to vote Democrat. I'm married, had 2 children. One of my sons took his own life. He had schizophrenia, like my mother. I had a psychotic episode. It runs in families, and I was in the hospital for a while, and this was all around my Damascus Road turnaround thing. But we served in Bangkok, and then I taught at Midwestern Seminary. The first time I taught above high school I taught at what used to be called the Baptist College at Charleston. It's now called Charleston Southern University in Charleston, South Carolina. I taught there, and then I ended up teaching at Western Seminary in Kansas City. And then in 2008, after a stint with a replant with Darrin Patrick, that we wrote a book together about that. He had been my student in 1994. I lost track of him, but then later I was looking for help with this kind of city church and so forth. Someone told me about Mark Driscoll. I hadn't heard of him. And the next thing I know, I'm realizing, well, Darrin's the vice president of this Acts 29 thing. And so we helped to replant this church I'd been in. And right when that was kind of completed and over, I was hired to teach at Beeson Divinity School, where my old teacher and my wife's teacher, she has an MDiv from Southern, and we met at Southern. And so since 2008, I've been here in Birmingham teaching historical theology.
Awesome. And was your dissertation, being historical theology, was your dissertation on Barth?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And was there a particular aspect to his theology that you were
Christian
analyzing?
life, faith, love, and hope.
Faith, love, and hope.
3 dimensions of the Christian life.
All right. And did that ever get published anywhere?
No, it's terrible. It's just awful. And, my supervisor, David Mueller, was kind of the Barth person in Baptist life at that time. And he really forced me to write it in a wooden way. And I had written some things earlier that weren't terrible. Okay. And so I was kind of feeling my oats like, could be a writer. And then he wanted to see every little step I made to see that and so he just demanded that I write worse than Barth. And Timothy George, who was the external reader, actually said, just because you're writing about Barth doesn't mean you have to write like Barth. No, that hasn't been published, but but it's useful like as a weapon to ward off assailants because it's a
Yeah,
very heavy, angular, pointy book. So it does have usefulness.
that's great. Well, I started coming across your work only in the last few years, and it turns out we had a lot of, paths that overlapped in kind of different generations. One of those was Darrin Patrick, who I want to talk about later. But I was on a space with you. Uh, Gosh, it must have been last year or the year before, and it was something to the effect of like, why do evangelicals love Trump so much? And you were on there and just really like passionately, explaining reality to people. And I remember being in that space and I was like, man, if people from my church hear this guy, they might get freaked out. Like he seems like, he's a Trumper. What's going on?
Yeah.
And so, but I wanted to give you opportunity, like to kind of explain what is it. There's all these polls that come out, and however you define evangelical, whatever, it does seem like evangelicals are just overwhelmingly in favor of Donald Trump. How do you explain that phenomenon, given that so many of the pastors and big evil leaders are so negative on him so often?
Well, I don't think it's surprising that some people are surprised because I think the problematic nature of Trump's demeanor and his past, um, his cockiness, his arrogance, his thin-skinnedness, there's just a whole array of things there that don't fit with these evangelicals like myself and the way we've been raised and what we view as the way a Christian should comport themselves. And so I don't think that's surprising that people are surprised. But I don't think this is a deep insight that others don't have. But I think that at that point in time, the Democrat Party had alienated enough evangelicals for long enough with troubling consequences enough. And I think the ones that were most triggering are some things that started happening before 2016 that were widely reported in California that involving children that was a big deal. And then just the array of issues that he ran on the border, the belief that he could do something about the economy, and I think probably, even though I'm blue collar and I think I understand very well that population, I would also say that probably a lot of people, even if they're not educated, let's say educated Southern white evangelicals, probably there's a lot of them who were like me who were not for Trump in the primaries. Anyway, here's what's true of me. I'll let others decide, how widespread it was. But I was not for Trump during the primaries, and I was afraid of what he might do. He was just such a wild man, such a wild card, outlier figure, freak of nature thing. But as soon as he was nominated, and I'm not saying I didn't know this is how I would feel. But as soon as he was nominated, it was a no-brainer for me immediately that I wouldn't vote for him because I had already left the Democratic Party long enough ago that I just knew I couldn't vote for a Democrat. Now, at that time, I had not reached the conclusion that the Democratic Party is evil. That is what I believe now. And even now, when I write about it, I'm careful to say I'm not talking about rank and file voters. But as a party, I believe it's evil, and therefore I think Christians, discerning Christians, shouldn't vote for them, and that pastors should help them see that. But I wasn't there at that time, but I was far enough. I was aware enough of why the Democrat Party is a great danger to what I hold dear about America and as a Christian in America, that it was not hard for me to. I understand why that. Okay, once he got the nomination, no, I'm not going to be voting for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
You see,
Yeah.
since then, I think, but I don't think I know what my view is that probably within a year and a half of his first term, I was very happy I'd voted for him because my fears didn't come true. The way he was attacked there's no excuse for the way he was attacked. and the way all of the institutions and the mainstream media were against him, and the craziness of the insanity and evil of the Democratic Party came out even more. I think Doug Wilson's called him an apocalypse, and he is an apocalypse. And I think probably Charlie Kirk is becoming an apocalypse too. So much is revealed that was underneath. And so when Trump gets in, I discover for the first time, oh yes, there is a deep state, and it's very deep, it's very powerful, and it's very wicked, and that many Republicans are caught up in it. I didn't know that. And
Sure.
that hatred of Trump brought that out. So I think the way I began to view my friends and acquaintances who are the elites that run the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, my view of their situation is there's kind of a statute of limitations or something that we can give grace for a while for you to learn. But if year after year goes by and you're still hating Trump, or still doing like John Piper and running out to try to give absolution for people that vote for Trump, well, then we have to start scrutinizing you too.
Right.
In other words, you can't learn forever on this stuff.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with thinking, the grip that the Democratic Party had on me and many, many Americans going back to Roosevelt. I'm not capable of a party ever having to sink its claws of loyalty in me now. It's just not possible. And so once this first term got underway, I guess my hope was, his base will grow. I thought he had a lot of accomplishments in the first term. And of course, it doesn't even come close to what he's doing now. But even then, I thought, this guy is a doer.
Yeah.
This guy, he really doesn't like it when people are killing each other. This is a guy that with all these things, these characteristics that are so off-putting, there's more to him. And a lot of that more to him is really good. If you'll just love him, he'll love you, and he'll try to be very loyal to whatever he promised. And he loves to accomplish things. And that is just not what we're used to with presidents.
Right.
There's a transparency and an accomplishment and so forth. And I think so it's been incredibly frustrating to see my friends and the movers and shakers at the top of Big Eva, at the top of my denomination, Southern Baptist Convention, to see them fail us in these days. But I think that we've come by that difficulty, honestly. I just think this negative world, as Aaron Wrenn puts it, we've never had that in this country. And so even in the days of slavery, both sides know that they have to reach to the Bible to defend what they're doing. And so it's a fight between people wielding the Bible at each other. This is different. And so we've not been in negative world. And so it makes perfect sense to me that we're not good at this.
Right.
That even if we're not Anabaptists, we're not Mennonites, we're not radical reformers, we're Baptists, and so we're more reformed. And we had the flag in our worship services, and we sang patriotic songs, the 4th of July. And some of my friends, including Mark Dever, taught me to be concerned and worried about that, and I bought into that. But now I've changed my mind on that. Now I've learned some things about society and patriotism and what makes for a world that's more yielded to Christ and so forth. But even though we were Baptists and not Anabaptists, and so we had a strong view of Christian citizenship in a nation, and honored the military and so forth, and felt a sense of bond, even with those parts of the country that we would trash, these mean Yankees or these crazy people out in California. At the same time, there were times when around sports or around times of national security problems or war, we felt very bonded like brothers and sisters with people all over the country, because we're all Americans, So we just haven't faced what we're facing now. And so what I like about the work you're doing and the work that American Reformers doing and founders and some others, Doug Wilson, is they're getting busy trying to recover resources and pressing new questions on the Bible that we never did so that we can lead in a time that's completely new to us. So I'm not surprised we're bad at it, but I'm disappointed at people who won't just get busy. Let's try to get better at it. And we can't just hand our children to these people that want to chop their genitals off. I mean, come on.
I know. I know. Yeah, and you nailed it there. That's kind of part of the project of the podcast and other writing I do is trying to remind people, hey, look, we have a whole history we can pull from as Christians. And of course, God's word is central, but we have a lot of people who've come before us who are much smarter, at least than me, who have thought about these things. We're not the first people that have necessarily encountered either a negative world or a hostile world or political arrangements that are not ideal or whatever it is. So yeah, that disappointment definitely rings true with me in terms of when I was looking at the landscape and the seminary that I went to and the networks I was part of. I was like, where are you guys? I thought y'all were on the cutting edge of innovation. And that kind of brings me to my next question for you. I've talked on the podcast before about the Young Restless Reform movement, and you've written on it. What would you say kind of defined that movement and what went wrong?
Well, first of all, I would have to say I have to be one of the most enthusiastic welcomers of the movement because I was Reformed, and none of us who were Reformed in those days, and maybe particularly those of us who were Southern Baptists and Reformed, none of us were even able. I think about that promise that God will do more than you could even ask or think. We wouldn't think to say, oh Lord, raise up a Reformed resurgence that being a Calvinist will be cool. That wasn't what we wanted, is to be tolerated. Now, we were sure that we ought to be tolerated because of our past was so Reformed, but we couldn't even think of that. So when this came along, the Driscoll iteration of the Young Restless and Reform movement, it was like me sitting down at my laptop and just typing in exactly what I want. And the reason is this: these people had the theology that I had adopted, and they wanted to go to the hardest places to win people for Christ. They wanted to go to the cities. My admiration for what they're trying to do could not be higher. And that hasn't changed at all. And so that's scratching that Baptist itch for souls and conversions and baptisms and church planting and all of that. So I was dazzled by it. I just wanted to help. And I wrote several chapters in books where I'm trying to interpret the movement to older Baptists, and I'm trying to interpret older Baptists to them. And sometimes Al Mohler does that too. And so it was something I was very happy to do. But I see it as growing out of the emerging movement, and I wrote some about that. There was a time when Mark Driscoll and some of the early members of the Reform Resurgence leaders were meeting with what this other wing of, what I decided to do. The language is so hard to nail down. I decided to use the word emerging for the broad movement, and then I called the left wing of it emergent.
Right. I remember this
The
now.
right wing, I called it emerging. And so the emergent, related to people like Brian McLaren, Doug Paget, and others, I call them the doctrine wary or doctrine averse stream of emerging. And so they either didn't want any doctrine or they wanted just as little as possible. And Erasmus of Rotterdam said one time, we need to have as few doctrines and believe them as lightly as possible in the interest of unity. And so that's kind of the way they were. And, let's live the life and so forth. And then the doctrine friendlies were these Reform folks. And, most spectacularly, Mark Driscoll, but also Darrin Patrick, who would be my student and then later my partner in a replant. But it didn't take long for these right-wing doctrine-friendly emerging folks to say, we don't want to be called that, and we're tired of having to answer questions and talk about how we're not like these others, because what defines us most is our doctrine. But I continue to say, well, you're still part of that movement because you're still concerned what they shared. They all wanted to reach people for Christ and how they understood that in the cities. And they wanted to reach these college educated, Democrat voting, blue communities in the cities and or wherever there's a college or university putting out the blue products that they do. And therefore that drew them into a lot of study of culture, which I liked. I liked all of that. Missionaries always do that, and anyone's wise if they're crossing cultures. There's nothing smart about being disinterested in who you're talking to. And so they wanted to understand who these people were. But it's a movement that grew out of kind of on the left wing. I call it a protest movement. They were really kind of hostile to existing churches.
Yeah.
On the doctrine friendly side, I call it dissatisfaction. These models don't work for us. But when people criticize them and say, well, they're just throwing tantrums, they're having like an adolescent, I said, well, church planting is a pretty impressive way. It's hard to plant churches. So if this is the way they're going to sow their wild oats, it's way better than cocaine and motorcycle and wild turkey. So, we need to. So I remember when very early John MacArthur publicly criticized Driscoll, and he put the tag he liked on the whole movement as pragmatic. I don't think that's the best one. I think now what I want to say is the movement is part of the seeker movement.
Okay.
Pragmatic's not as good as seeker, I don't think, even though I don't think the Driscoll iteration meant to be. I think they meant to not be seeker sensitive. But I think Keller, he turned it into a seeker movement, and I think he meant to, but whether he did or not, he turned it into that. And what I mean by that is that, like Protestant liberals, they study the people they're trying to reach and remove unnecessary stumbling blocks. That's the Protestant liberals. And they, as self-conscious liberals, they're ready to chuck stuff overboard, because Protestant liberalism is not a save Christianity movement. It's a salvage movement. Salvage as much as you can. And so you have people saying, well, no, modern men and women can't, the resurrection is not relevant to them. They can't believe that. So we'll give them, usually some version of a subjective view of the atonement. Christ is a model. Their critics said, well, when Bultmann is raised from the dead, I think the relevance of the resurrection will kick in pretty quick. But the evangelical iterations of seeker sensitive were what I would call the Hybels model, and you could also put in maybe a second one with the purpose driven. Okay, but then it's Keller, and all of these groups had fully orbed conservative confessional statements. So if you accuse them of being heretics or liberals, then they would just dust off the confessional statement and say, we believe this. What about the Bible? We believe it from Genesis to the maps. And let's just grant them utter sincerity on it. But the difference was both purpose-driven and the earlier seeker with Hybels, they admitted up front that doctrine's not going to be central.
Sure.
Even though we believe it all, that's not going to be central.
Yeah.
But for the Reformed, they said it is going to be central. And I just think we can just grant them that they meant that. But the difference now is the first two iterations, their target was suburban America. And so that ends up being the predictor of how they brand, message, and eventually platform. And I've come to believe that that's the window into too much of what they're delivering, no matter what they say they believe. And that's how the reform resurgence with Driscoll and Keller. I think Driscoll's didn't have winsomeness as a big thing. He's assaulting people, sending them to hell, and he was, he was more indigenous to his context than Keller ever was to Manhattan.
Right.
But I do think they'll say, well, we want to talk about church health, not church growth, and I'm happy to talk about both. I'm with some of these professors that they'll slam people for being concerned about numbers. And I will raise my little hand like Gomer Pyle and say, well, there is somebody else concerned about numbers, God. Now they have to stop and show off like Trump about how big it is. Look at how many people. Nobody's ever seen anything like it before. And so people are concerned about numbers. And so I think it might be significant that Mars Hill ended up 3 times as big as Keller. So if they want to say the only way to do this is to put winsomeness front and center, well, Driscoll didn't.
Right.
But the difference is now they're focused on blue communities.
Yep.
So that, first of all, I don't gainsay studying the sources of the leaders of these movements in terms of how they were shaped spiritually or theologically. I think there's a lot to learn in that. I came to the view that if you want to find something that accounts for the most of what they've said and done that folks like us have criticized, and then predict what they'll say and do or not say and not do going forward, you really don't need a Bible. You need to discern what they're discerning about the group they're trying to reach.
Right.
And that's where their branding, messaging, and then platforming will kick in, so that somebody like Vody Balcom, who shares their theology utterly, can't have him.
Right.
Because he'll turn off the blue community. And that's also, it will show where they go unwinsome.
Yep.
Winsome is not really an inviolable part of their methodology. What determines where there can be unwinsomeness is when they discern that the blue communities they want to reach require you to show some unwinsomeness.
Yeah.
And they'll show it. It became so sad, but also kind of exciting that this is starting to make way more sense to me. And you say, well, wait a minute, because I have close friends who are Reformed and they're working harder to be nice to all sides, which I want to happen. I want to be nicer as well. But they'll say, well, did Tim Keller decide to ordain women? Well, has Tim Keller embraced pro-choice? And that's where I come back to this. And some of these people they're as old as me, and they remember how our seminaries, Southern Baptist seminaries, were able to go very far left and get way away from their constituency that paid their salaries. And they still signed the doctrinal statement. And this was like patting old gray-headed men on the head and saying, you were great for your time, and we're not going to let you interrupt us with what we're doing in our time. And so so just because that's on the books, so the issue with Kirsten Powers shows what they did with it. She was able to be there as pro-choice and as pro-homosexuality for years, sitting under Tim's preaching and in his wife's small group, and didn't discover what their views were. Those weren't part of the branding and the messaging.
Totally.
And so then when she discovers it, she's freaked out. If I had heard this, I never would have come in here. Well, that's what they were thinking. She never would have come. Then she finds this like support group that's already up and running for people that feel deceived by these seeker-sensitive evangelicals.
Sure. That makes sense.
I answered your question, but I enjoyed saying all that stuff.
No, it was great stuff. I think one of the things I saw recently after the assassination of Charlie Kirk is a lot of people have, you might say, woken up. They've seen kind of apocalyptic, like you referenced. And there's been a lot of literature, tweets, other things saying, look, there's a lot of people out there who actually are interested in coming to church, who want to hear about God, who need to hear the gospel. How can we reach them? And, people like me are offering, hey, look, it's not like rocket science. You don't have to go reinvent your church. Just be a normal Bible believing church and preach the gospel. It's not like we're trying to rebrand our churches. We're just saying, look, the low hanging fruit, just like Paul on his missionary journeys, look for the God-fearers first. And any town he went to, these are the God-fearers. They're out there. Go find them. Stop obsessing so much over the blue-haired septum ring lesbian on campus who's probably never going to darken the door of your church, and focus on the people you can reach. Now, what I saw this past week was the Gospel Coalition. It looked like a talking points memo went out with a lot of these big Eva figures, J.D. Greear and others. where they're trying to rebrand this thing as seeker sensitive. They're saying, well, that's just seeker sensitive, which is odd, very odd behavior from them. How do you explain that? I mean, being so familiar with the movements and these figures and these leaders, do they view this as a slam dunk case? They're like, look, y'all are just trying to be Charlie Kirk Church, and that's seeker sensitive, and you shouldn't do that. Is that kind of their logic? How did they come to that conclusion?
Well, if my hypothesis is correct about what direction they go and what direction they don't, and the Charlie Kirk assassination aftermath is really big. Now, what do I mean by really big? I would say maybe something like this. If it turns out to be half as culture shaping as the post Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, that'll be incredibly huge. We don't know what it's going to be, but at this point, many older people and observers of this kind of thing on all sides of the culture and wars and politics are saying and behaving as though it is big right now. That doesn't mean it'll be sustained. But if it is big and if it is sustained, and if my hypothesis is right, then these institutions are going to shift towards it, because I think you predict so it won't be for the right reason, but that's okay. I'm fine. And so what do we see happening? We see in institutions that wouldn't have dreamed of it, firing people when they say the wrong thing about Charlie Kirk.
Right.
Okay, that couldn't have happened before the assassination. We see entity heads, Southern Baptist entity heads, who've never platformed Charlie or anybody from TPUSA feeling compelled to say something about it and talk nice about it. And so I'm going to be writing in the future and say, well, some of us discovered him before. Some of us were saying that his way of engaging culture and politics is way closer to what we need to be doing than what you all have been trying to do with Third Way or whatever. And so now you're doing that, see? So it doesn't surprise me, because they're trying to figure out how big is it. And so the seminaries need to reach young people. Okay, Charlie has influenced young people. They need to get students in there.
Yep.
And they themselves, even though Baptist is still in the name, are very happy, especially with the demographic cliff that's come to the colleges and all of this. They love the word to go out that hey, we educate whoever comes our way. I mean, when I was at Midwestern, we had a couple of people that were part of not the LDS, but the RLDS church that's centered there in Independence. There's dollar signs as well. And I understand, if you got an institution, you got infrastructure, you got people to pay, I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
But here's the difference. The kind of leadership we've got in the SBC is, I'll call it leadership, and it's a kind that we need, and it's impressive. But it's not the kind you need in a cultural moment like this. The kind we have is the kind that works hard at institutional asset cultivation, growth, protection, the viability of the institution. Big deal. But that's the difference. We need leadership now that blazes a trail and gets people to follow them. So that's what Trump does. Trump's a leader like that. We're going this way, and he inspired. That's what Charlie Kirk is. Charlie Kirk didn't decide what his message would be or what he would do by putting a wet finger up in the air.
Yeah.
He might be right, he might be wrong, but he's a leader like that. And we don't have any of those. Okay, we just don't have them. And so we can't expect them to lead that way. But what we can do is say, okay, you said all these nice things about Charlie Kirk and TPUSA. All right, you're old, you're going to retire. Would you be happy with a president at Southern Seminary or Southeastern Seminary who just doesn't like Charlie at all, thinks he was really bad on the engagement with politics? That's questions we need to answer. Yeah. That's questions the trustees should answer. And so, because now you're talking nice about him, and we'll try not to bring up the fact that you acted like he didn't exist until he was shot, but only if you'll give us a Charlie now, if you have any.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a very important cultural moment. Part of my attraction to the Driscoll Keller, the whole interest in studying culture was that I, as a missionary, do believe we study the people that we're trying to reach because we don't want to unnecessarily offend them and turn them off and push them away so that we can offend them when we tell them what we're really going to say
Sure.
and so forth. And so I think that we're in a time right now where if the culture turns this way and keeps going that way, it'll be God blessing us with a situation where our institution heads are more concerned with losing the Charlie Kirk perspective students than the blue community perspective students. The way they used culture, though, was this. They studied, first of all, the left wing emerging. They were different than Protestant liberals in that Protestant liberals weren't interested in anything in the past. If it was old, it was irrelevant. But the emergent church, like Brian McLaren, they would ransack history and the history of the church. But they did so like liberals, where they knew what they were looking for ahead of time, and they were ready to get resources. And it wasn't important that it be Enlightenment resources. It could be resources related to with the mystery and arts and other things. But like liberals, they stand above the Bible and history, and they separate wheat from chaff on whether it will fulfill an agenda that's already been determined. And that's true in a unique way with each of the great figures of liberalism, whether it's Schleiermacher or it's Ritschl or it's Harnack or it's Bultmann or it's Tillich. All of these people had this different kind of thing they were looking for. And evangelicals are even worse in their basic apologetic stance because they just want to find out anything you want and try to give it to you. Whereas each of these other figures had some real substantive, deep thing that also shouldn't be deciding how we share the gospel, but they were kind of had a dogmatic part to their apologetics.
Sure.
What we're not good at, and what Charlie was interested in, and what you're interested in, and what we're learning that Christ is interested in, is studying culture because it belongs to him, and that his blessings that he died on the cross to give us include culture, include the political landscape, and that love of neighbor can't be nonchalant about any of that stuff. And so I think Charlie learned a lot across the years, and he changed in really good ways. He deepened himself. And it's very different from the way, I don't know, a Matt Chandler or kind of hyper and snatching at things, and there's a brilliance to it, and there's insightfulness to it. But there's somehow a lack of seriousness, a lack of soberness, a lack of deep learning. You look at Charlie, it's just the opposite.
Yep.
There's deep learning going on. You go back each year, and he's less smart. He's less smart. He's just getting smarter. And there's a that happened these last 2 years with Charlie. And so I think as far as the institutions of the SBC, that's what I care about deeply with regard to this, is that if the culture changes enough towards Charlie, then the SBC will be great, will benefit greatly. And that's better than trying to figure out what makes the blue communities mad.
Yep, I agree. And one of the ways, I mean, I like the way you tested it is like, okay, cool. You kind of say, hey, we like Charlie, we're so sad, all that kind of stuff. Great. Make Charlie a professor or start a center or something. But even for a layperson in the church, the way I think about it is, if hopefully they've got a good pastor has their back. But a lot of these pastors that are now all of a sudden saying Charlie's great, if that layman were to send out a tweet, and literally I've had this thought experiment in my head, you could just copy paste everything he said and make it your Twitter account and just count the minutes until you get kicked out of that church.
That's
Because
right.
they're gonna do putting their finger in the wind, going, okay, I see we're supposed to do this, but when the rubber meets the road and their own people start living like Charlie Kirk, that pastor all of a sudden is going to have to reconcile his own the paradox he's created in his mind. I've got all these Christians that are conservative and vote for Trump, and yet I want to reach these people over here that don't want anything to do with church. And if they hear that all these people, they voted for Trump in crazy numbers, and they love ICE, and they want deportations. Well, I've got to shield these two groups from ever knowing each other. Otherwise, that person will never come in. And so by putting that pastor to the test, kind of a pressure test, is just tweet out what Charlie tweeted, see what happens. I'm not saying it'll always go well, but that's kind of some of the stuff I've been thinking on.
Both John MacArthur and John Piper exhibited that Baptist reticence to allow politics to become important enough to cut them off from parts of their market that they wanted to be welcoming to. I don't know how many years ago, but more than 10, probably 15 or 20 years ago, when someone pointed out to MacArthur, well, look at all this stuff you disagree with what the Democrats are doing. He said, yeah, but I don't want to reduce my prospects for conversion by half by taking a stand like that. And Piper had that too, and that helped them. That was a tie that, Piper did some things obviously in the direction of the work of the Holy Spirit that MacArthur would never embrace and so forth, but they did have that. But to me, see, of course, we wish we had a world. In fact, part of my prayer is we need a Democrat Party that's not evil. I don't like the prospect of every election is whatever the Republicans happen to be and evil. I'd rather have, remember when the question was, well, are you saying, Russell Moore said, are you saying vote for the lesser of two evils? I'm thinking, well, yeah. But actually, I think our elections has been more evil or not evil.
Right.
Evil or really bad. And so I want the Democratic Party to change. But as long as the Democrat Party is where it is now, it's just is an abandonment of our responsibility and stewardship to Jesus Christ, not to say there's just no way to justify welcoming that party into the halls of power and aiding and abetting transgenderism and abortion and an array of other things.
Yeah, it's crazy. One thing before I let you go, I wanted to make sure we talked about Darrin, who I don't really get to talk much about on the podcast. I want to share my kind of experience with Darrin, which wasn't a long time. And I wanted to hear from you a little bit about Darrin because you worked with him, you're a professor and all that. But, once Darrin left ministry at his church plant in St. Louis, my understanding, and this is really shaped, I mean, if you're a listener, this may explain some things, but my understanding was he pretty much got blacklisted and wasn't like he never really heard from the people he thought he was friends turned out to be work associates. And when he was no longer in the industry and in that space, those people were just like, you're useless to me. And that really hurt him. At least I sat with him when he cried and told me about this. And he came out and preached at our church, and we got to know him over the last few years before he took his life. But he was welcomed in by ARC, and he started flirting with some ideas about women pastors towards the end of his life. And I would always badger him about it because I'm like, Darrin, come on, you're the church planting, and it's men. That was your thing. But he was just looking for people that would actually welcome him and help him get the help he needs and love on him. So it makes sense from a human perspective. But it was really sad when I found out that he had taken his life. And that was right. That's one of the things that a lot of people, it was very personal to us because he was older than us. We viewed him as like a very successful figure that had fallen from grace. He had been gracious to us. He's big, tall, affable, gregarious, smart. And so I felt honored to just be his friend towards the end of his life. And then you have the kind of the sequence of events for me. People ask what happened in 2020. You had COVID and you had BLM, and then trans blew up. But right in the middle of that was Darrin taking his own life. And I think that was like a horseman of the apocalypse for me in terms of, I don't want to, I got to reevaluate how I'm doing ministry. If that's the end of the road for somebody like him, I want to make sure that's not the end of the road for somebody like me, as much as I admire him and appreciate him. So I just wanted to hear some of your, knowing that's kind of my background, my relationship with him, as short as it was, maybe some of your memories of him and what he was like and what you think was going on with Darrin.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I see in Darrin is that, and it was one of the things that I felt. You were deeper. You were deep in Acts 29. I mainly just knew Darrin. Every now and then I would end up with Acts 29 people and so forth. What I believe one of the things Acts 29 became skilled at was something they wanted to be skilled at, and that is they wanted to be able to identify skill sets that would make it more likely that this person could make it in the church and so forth. And I thought that is a very good thing to do if it can be done. We ought to try to do that. We know there'll be outliers, but in that time, I mean, Darrin really was one of those people. And then the person that we got to replant the church in Kansas City where I was, he was like that. I suspect you're like that. I suspect Michael Clary is like that. And so Darrin was like that. And what do I mean by that in Darrin's case specifically? Is that Darrin was a natural leader in the sense that he just has to lead and he has to accomplish. And he's full of energy and passion for all of that. He also is a person who won't take care of himself, won't stop and rest and keep things in perspective. That's true too. And I think that this era of mega churches and celebrity pastors, that as sinners, we just don't do well with success measured in buildings, bodies, and bucks, many of us. And so that happened to him, and that happened to Mark Driscoll, and that happened to Matt Chandler. People get very, very successful by those indices when they're young. And I just think it takes the favor of God in a special way to hold them together. And then I'll say this, and I don't like to put people on the couch. I don't like people to put me on the couch. A lot of times when people don't like your ideas, well, they put you on the couch. But you got issues. Okay, all right. Can we just be men and talk about these ideas for 5 minutes? But I had a really great father, and the older I get, the more I think that the problems I've had, I mean, they've been big. I was an intravenous drug user. I can be very cocky and hard driving and, you know, talk like I know more than that's kind of how I try out my ideas. I remember when you believe this other thing just as passionately. They say I know. I was just dead wrong, wasn't I? It's very embarrassing. But so I've got all kind of problems, but there's something about my father, I think, that I don't know. It just seems to set a limit on how lost I can feel or something. I'm not sure I have the language for it, but I bring it up because Darren's relationship with his father was not what it ought to be. He talked to a lot of people about it. When he left the journey, there was a team put together, to pray with him and talk to him, and I was part of that team. So we had to get together. And there was a lake house he had down in Little Egypt on the Illinois side of St. Louis, and we would meet there, and we did the book and so forth. But there's something there. There's something there that was a weak spot. He brought it up a lot. He talked about it a lot, and he said some of the things to me he said to you, but I was still stunned by it, and I felt that this reception by ARC, and they were using him, and they were using his wife, and he'd be okay. But suicide's in my family. My mother committed suicide. I have a son who took his life 2 years ago, and it's just a devastating dimension of the fall that it needs to remind us that we're glad our home is not in this world ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah. And I resonate with that. Thankfully, my relationship with my dad is really good. He's here right now. I'm gonna go hit golf balls with him and the kids after this. But yeah, I did see a lot of that in Acts 29 and other ministries, not just Acts 29, but any man, whether minister or not, God has done a great work with me and my dad to heal divides and restore, but a lot of that took me taking responsibility for me having bitterness in my heart and me needing to own where when I was a teenager, I wasn't necessarily the easiest to get along with. And some of those traits still stick with me, and
Right.
that they can be great, but they can also not be so great sometimes to experience. But yeah, I have seen a lot of that. And that makes, it's hard because in reformed doctrinal, evangelicalism or even history, there's not a lot of resources we can pull from to talk about the importance of having that father. I mean, obviously theologically we can talk about the importance of it, but in terms of what it does to someone's soul when they don't have that groundedness, and then you pair that with kind of the modern world where everybody's moving around so much and success
Yeah.
is fairly easy to come by, so to speak, and you can just kind of become bigger than yourself and not rooted and not grounded and not have a community that knew you and changed your diapers and, watched you grow up through puberty and they don't know you. You can just feel like you're putting on a show all the time. That makes me really sad for all men, but particularly pastors who feel they got to live that way to either prove themselves, their worth. And it's a big heart I have for all men. But I also don't spend too much time. I think in ministry, it's really important that you don't just ruminate, which seemed to be what
Right.
Darrin would do.
Wallow in it.
Right. It is what it is. That doesn't mean we need to forget the lessons we learned, but we do need to forgive. We need to have peace with God. And that should be an indicator. Hey, maybe I need to put some things in place in my life, some limits or something where those wounds or whatever you wanted to call them, those
Uh-huh.
proclivities aren't exacerbated and we don't give the devil a foothold. But that's kind of the lesson I would take. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Well, one of the things you said that I think is crucial that I want to do a whole book on it, but two things I would say. You mentioned people moving around. I really want to do a book called Love Abides. How do you love people if you're changing up the people you're with every 3 or 4 years? And the other thing is that we talk about cultural Christianity. And so while I was against cultural Christianity, I was busy enjoying the benefits of cultural Christianity, not knowing that's what it was.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that's most disturbing that I've realized is that those of us my age who are just disoriented, say the world's going crazy, and we're trying to, and the Republicans and the talking heads are trying to make common sense bear up what only religion can, because they don't know how to talk about religion. Well, that's well, no, it used to be common sense that homosexuality was wrong and harmful, and
Right.
now it's not. So common sense is not a source of knowledge; it's a receptacle. And so, but here's what hit me: those of us who are disoriented because we're older and we remember so well a different world where the neighbors could spank us,
Right.
where people didn't lock things. Like when my students now, as I'm realizing I have no idea what's going on inside their heads, and I'm trying to come up with ways to try to let them use their imagination of how different my world was as a child. Imagine nobody locking anything and no one thinking you were being irresponsible. Okay. Here's the problem. Those of us who experienced a culture that was so much more Christian and so much more, I wrote a book, Shalom, where I try to describe why is that word used? It's when everything God created is functioning the way it should. I experienced a world that had way more shalom in it. But here's the problem. We didn't create that world. Those of us who experienced it, we're able to grieve over the loss of it in ways that younger people can't. But it doesn't mean we know how to get it because we didn't build it. And so that's part of the great difficulty we're in, is that not only is the memory of what that might be like, but even the people who have the memory, we inherited it as a blessing. We didn't build it. So that's why things like Charlie Kirk, we need these big things that God would do that accomplishes a whole bunch of stuff that none of us really know how to do, even if we know that what we're facing ain't right.
Right. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, Mark, this was great. I could talk to you for a long time, but like I said, I got to go to the range with my dad and
Okay.
hang out with him. But I really appreciate you coming on. If people want to keep up with the work you're doing, what's the best place that they can follow you or keep up?
I'm too lazy to have a platform, and so I depend on people like you, but I write a lot at American Reformer, and I write at the Center for Baptist Leadership, and I write at the Federalist and American Spectator and some other places. But maybe I'll grow up and get a platform. I don't know. I tried to get on Substack, and so Michael Clary said, "Finally." I said, "No, I'm just trying to read something. I'm not gonna do that." So they'll just find me when you tell them to find me.
Okay, great. I'll start posting all your articles.
Good. Thank you.
All right, Mark, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mark DeVine. I know I did. Lots of wisdom to glean from him and learn from somebody who's been through a lot of battles, seen a lot of life, and could offer us really unique insights into what's going on in the church and in the world. As always, subscribe, smash that subscribe button or the like button, whatever you're supposed to hit, do that on YouTube. You can share this episode with a friend who may still be stuck in a Young Restless Reformed environment, and it can help them grow in wisdom. You can also give this show a rating on iTunes or Spotify, maybe your podcast app, wherever you listen to your podcast. Give it a great rating so that more people can find it. Leave a review so that more people can show up in the recommended podcast feed. But anyways, thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.